In the unforgiving dust of the Colorado Territory, a woman's worth was measured by the children she could bear. When 22-year-old Clementine was declared barren, her own flesh and blood dragged her to a trading post to be sold to the highest bidder. She expected to be bought by a monster. Instead, she was claimed by a towering mountain man with 5 motherless children trailing behind him and a deadly secret that would shatter her entire world. The sun beat down on the town of Oakhaven like a blacksmith's hammer on a hot anvil. It was the summer of 1883, and the sweeping winds off the San Juan Mountains offered no relief to the desperate souls choking on the dust of the valley. Inside the Oakhaven Mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, and the sour stench of stale whiskey and sweat. Clementine Hayes stood in the center of the wooden floor, her hands bound loosely in front of her with a piece of frayed hemp rope. It was a symbolic binding, but it cut into her pride far deeper than it bit into her wrists. She stared at the scuffed toes of her boots, unable to look at the faces of the townsfolk who had gathered to watch the spectacle. She was 22 years old, a widow, and according to the harsh laws of frontier survival, entirely useless. Her late husband, Hiram, had succumbed to cholera a year prior, leaving her with nothing but a crumbling homestead and a painful legacy. 4 years of marriage, and not a single child to show for it. In a land where a woman's primary duty was to populate the empty expanses and provide hands for the harvest, an empty womb was a curse. Her parents, Josiah and Agnes Hayes, stood beside her. Josiah, a man whose spine had been crooked by years of fruitless labor in a dry silver claim, was nervously turning his battered Stetson in his hands. Agnes refused to look at her daughter, her face a mask of pious severity. They had lost their claim. The First National Bank of Denver was threatening to seize their wagon and mules. They were destitute, and in their desperation, they had reduced their only daughter to currency. "She's a hard worker, Boone." Josiah's voice cracked, sounding pathetic in the cavernous mercantile. "She can cook, sew a straight seam without a Montgomery Ward pattern, and she's quiet. Never talks back." Jedediah Boone, the owner of the local saloon and the man holding Josiah's gambling markers, chewed on the end of a foul-smelling cigar. Boone was a vile, heavy-set man with eyes like dead black beetles. He circled Clementine, looking her up and down as if she were a prize heifer at the county fair. "She's a dry well, Josiah," Boone spat, a stream of brown tobacco juice narrowly missing Clementine's skirt. "Everybody in Oakhaven knows it. Hiram worked himself to the bone, and she couldn't even give him a son to carry the name. What good is a barren woman to me? I run a saloon, not a charity ward." "She can clean the rooms. She can warm a bed," Josiah pleaded, his voice bordering on a whine. "I owe you $200, Jedediah. Take the girl and wipe the slate clean. It's a fair trade." Clementine closed her eyes, fighting the bile rising in her throat. Warm a bed. Her own father was selling her into prostitution to pay off a whiskey and faro debt. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, cutting a clean track through the dust on her face. But she remained silent. Screaming would do no good. Out here, the law was written by men with money, and Boone had all of it. 150, Boone countered, reaching out to grab Clementine's chin with thick, grease-stained fingers. "And she works off the other 50 serving drinks." Before Josiah could eagerly accept the devil's bargain, the heavy wooden doors of the mercantile slammed open. The hinges shrieked in protest, and the sudden influx of blinding afternoon light cast a long, imposing shadow across the floorboards. The murmuring crowd fell dead silent. Stepping into the mercantile was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite peaks of the San Juans. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad beneath a heavy, dust-caked canvas duster. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a striking, piercing shade of pale blue, locked onto the scene with terrifying intensity. A Winchester rifle rested casually over his right shoulder, and a heavy Colt revolver hung low on his hip. But it was not just the man that drew the town's stunned silence. Behind him, huddled like frightened quail, were 5 children. The oldest, A boy of about 14 with angry, defensive eyes stood closest to the man. Beside him was a girl of 12 with matted blonde hair, holding the hand of an 8-year-old boy. Clinging to the man's left leg was a tiny girl, no older than 5, and strapped securely to the man's broad chest in a leather sling was a sleeping infant. This was Gideon Cross. He was a phantom, a recluse who lived high up on the treacherous ridges of Devil's Roost. Folk in Oakhaven told stories about him that he was a renegade, an outlaw hiding from the noose, or a madman who conversed only with wolves. Gideon walked slowly toward the counter, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan. He stopped a few feet from Boone, his pale blue eyes dropping to Boone's hand, which was still gripping Clementine's chin. "Take your hand off her." Gideon's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in Clementine's chest. Boone blinked, releasing Clementine and taking a defensive step back. "This ain't your business, Mountain Man. Josiah here is settling a legal debt." "I heard the price," Gideon said, ignoring Boone and turning his piercing gaze to Josiah. The older man flinched under the scrutiny. Gideon reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy, drawstring leather pouch. He tossed it onto the wooden counter. It landed with a solid, heavy thud that spoke of significant weight. $300, Gideon said flatly, in raw gold dust and nuggets. It covers your debt to the saloon, and it buys her contract. Josiah's eyes went wide, his hands shaking as he reached for the pouch. He opened it, and the dull, unmistakable gleam of unrefined gold caught the lantern light. Boone leaned over, his eyes filled with sudden, ravenous greed. "Now wait just a damn minute," Boone sneered. "I had a prior claim." Gideon shifted his Winchester just an inch. The subtle, lethal movement silenced Boone instantly. "The gold pays the debt. The woman comes with me." Clementine stared at the giant of a man. She was terrified of Boone, but the prospect of being dragged into the unforgiving wilderness by a wild mountain man sent a different kind of chill down her spine. "Why?" Clementine whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and fear. It was the first time she had spoken all day. Gideon looked down at her. Up close, she could see the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and a profound, lingering sorrow that mirrored her own. "Because my children need a mother," Gideon answered quietly, his tone devoid of any romance or softness. It was a statement of raw, practical necessity. "And I don't need a breeder. I need a survivor." He drew a hunting knife from his belt in a flash of silver. Clementine gasped and shut her eyes, but she only felt the sudden release of tension as the blade sliced through the hemp rope binding her wrists. "Gather whatever belongings you have," Gideon instructed, turning his back to the stunned crowd. "We ride for the ridge before the sun drops." The journey up the mountain was a grueling, silent ordeal. Gideon had secured a sturdy, sure-footed mountain mare for Clementine, but the path was so steep and treacherous that she often had to lean forward and clutch the saddle horn just to keep from sliding off backwards. The children walked alongside the horses with an endurance that shocked her. The oldest boy, Levi, took the lead, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line with a suspicion that seemed far too heavy for a 14-year-old. The 12-year-old girl, Hannah, walked close to Clementine's stirrup. She had a bruised, withdrawn aura about her, never speaking, only occasionally looking up at Clementine with wide, questioning eyes. The 8-year-old, Samuel, marched stoically, while the 5-year-old, Mary, rode in front of Gideon on his massive black gelding. The baby, Ezra, remained strapped to Gideon's chest, mercifully sleeping through the jarring ride. As they climbed higher, the oppressive heat of Oakhaven gave way to the crisp, thin air of the alpine wilderness. The scent of dust was replaced by the sharp, clean fragrance of pine needles and damp earth. Clementine's mind was a whirlwind of grief, anger, and terror. Her parents hadn't even said goodbye. Once Josiah had his hands on the gold, he and Agnes had practically vanished from the mercantile. She was completely untethered from the world she knew, bought and paid for by a stranger. "Are they all yours?" Clementine finally broke the silence, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind rushing through the canyon. Gideon didn't look back. "They are my responsibility. That's all that matters. The evasion was glaring. It only deepened the mystery surrounding the brooding giant. They reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and bleeding crimson. The homestead was built on a wide, natural plateau, the Devil's Roost. It was an impressive, sturdy structure made of thick, interlocking logs, flanked by a barn and a stone smokehouse. But as Clementine dismounted and walked toward the porch, the signs of neglect were painfully obvious. Weeds choked the front garden. The windows were opaque with grime. Inside, the cabin was a disaster. Piles of unwashed woolen laundry sat in corners. The cast-iron stove was coated in weeks of grease and ash, and the air smelled heavily of burnt porridge and unbathed bodies. It was the chaotic aftermath of a family trying to survive without its core. Gideon unstrapped the baby from his chest. Little Ezra was flushed, his breathing slightly raspy. Gideon held the infant awkwardly, his massive hands clearly unsuited for the delicate task. For a fleeting moment, the mountain man looked utterly, hopelessly defeated. Clementine watched him. She could have sat down and wept. She could have cursed her fate and refused to lift a finger for the man who had bought her like a mule. But as she looked at the 5 dirty, exhausted faces staring at her, waiting to see what kind of woman had been brought to them, a spark of stubborn resolve ignited in her chest. Her parents had thrown her away because they believed she was broken. She would not let this mountain break her too. Without a word, Clementine dropped her small canvas satchel by the door, walked over to Gideon, and held out her arms. "Give him to me," she said softly. Gideon hesitated, his blue eyes searching her face. Slowly, he handed over the baby. Ezra whimpered, but as Clementine tucked him against her shoulder and began a gentle, rhythmic sway, the infant quieted down. "Levi," Clementine said, her voice finding a sudden, authoritative strength, "I need fresh water from the pump, and I need firewood. Hannah, show me where the clean rags are, and find me a basin. Samuel, go help your father stable the horses." The children blinked in surprise. They looked to Gideon for confirmation. Gideon gave a curt nod. Instantly, the cabin sprang into motion. Over the next 4 hours, Clementine worked like a woman possessed. She boiled water, scrubbed the worst of the grease from the stove, and managed to patch together a passable stew from dried venison, wild onions, and potatoes she found in the root cellar. She washed the children's faces, her touch gentle but firm, and finally got baby Ezra to drink a little watered-down goat's milk before his fever broke. By midnight, the children were fast asleep in the loft. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. Gideon sat at the heavy oak table, cleaning his Winchester. He hadn't said a word to her since they arrived, but she could feel his eyes tracking her every movement. "There's a cot in the back room for you," Gideon finally said, his voice low. "I sleep in the barn." Clementine paused, a rag in her hand. "You bought me to be your wife." "I bought you to be a mother to them," Gideon corrected, snapping the rifle's lever shut. "I told you, I need a survivor to keep this family alive. I don't need a bedmate. You're safe here, Clementine. As long as you care for them, you'll never want for food, shelter, or protection." He stood up, grabbing his lantern. "Don't go wandering past the tree line. There are things in these woods worse than wolves." With that, he walked out the heavy front door, locking it from the outside. Clementine stood alone in the dim light. She was exhausted down to her marrow, but sleep evaded her. She needed to find an extra blanket for the cot. She took a candle and walked into the small back bedroom that had presumably belonged to Gideon and his late wife. The room was sparse. As she opened a heavy wooden chest at the foot of the bed to look for linens, her hand brushed against a false bottom. The wood shifted, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the blankets. Curiosity overcoming her manners, Clementine reached inside. She pulled out a heavy metal object and a stack of letters bound in twine. She held the metal object up to the candlelight and gasped. It was a silver shield, Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Her trembling hands untied the twine around the letters. They were formal reports, stamped with the seal of the Denver Territorial Governor. She opened the top letter and scanned the elegant cursive. Operative Cross, your cover is compromised. The men who murdered your partner, Agent Miller, have tracked his orphan children to the Colorado Territory. You must keep Miller's children hidden at all costs. The local authorities in Oakhaven are corrupt and in the pocket of the syndicate. If Jedediah Boone discovers the children's true identities, they will be slaughtered. Clementine dropped the letter, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. The children weren't Gideon's. He wasn't a renegade mountain man at all. He was a Pinkerton detective, hiding his murdered partner's children. And the very men hunting them, the men who would kill them all, were the men she had just left down in the town of Oakhaven. She hadn't just been bought into a family. She had been bought into a war. The morning sun broke over the jagged spine of the San Juan Mountains, bleeding pale gold light through the grimy windows of the cabin. Clementine had not slept a single wink. She sat rigidly at the heavy oak table, her hands folded over the stack of Pinkerton reports and the silver detective's shield. When the heavy wooden door finally creaked open and Gideon stepped inside, carrying an armful of split pine, he stopped dead in his tracks. His pale blue eyes dropped to the table, taking in the exposed letters. The air in the cabin suddenly grew thick and dangerous, suffocating in its intensity. Gideon slowly set the firewood down on the hearth, his jaw ticking tight beneath his thick beard. "You went going through things that don't belong to you," Gideon said, his gravelly voice dangerously quiet. "And you bought a woman under false pretenses?" Clementine shot back, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She stood up, her small frame dwarfed by the sheer size of the room and the man before her. Yet she refused to shrink. "You aren't a renegade mountain man, Gideon Cross. You are an operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and these children, they aren't yours. The reports say they belong to a Wyatt Miller." Gideon stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then he let out a harsh, exhausted breath and pulled out a chair, sinking into it as if the weight of the entire Colorado Territory rested upon his broad shoulders. "Wyatt was my partner," Gideon began, his gaze fixing on the cold iron of the stove. "We were sent to Oakhaven 6 months ago to investigate a string of missing silver shipments and illegal land grabs. The local sheriff is on the payroll of a syndicate boss. We found the ledgers proving everything. The man running the entire bloody operation, starving out honest miners and stealing their claims, is Jedediah Boone." Clementine gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The man who had almost bought her for $150 was a murderous crime lord. "Boone's men found Wyatt before we could get the ledgers to Denver," Gideon continued, his voice devoid of emotion, a deliberate detachment masking his grief. "They ambushed his wagon on the valley road. They gunned him down, and they shot his wife, Mary, dead in the dirt. I was riding a mile behind them. By the time I caught up, it was too late. Wyatt bled out in my arms." His last words were a plea to save his children. Gideon looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, terrifying desperation. "I took the kids, I took the ledgers, and I ran up this mountain. Boone knows Wyatt had a partner, but he doesn't know my face, and he doesn't know I have the children or the evidence. If he finds out, he will slaughter every single person in this cabin to cover his tracks." Clementine felt the floor tilt beneath her. The gold Gideon had used to buy her wasn't his life savings. It was confiscated syndicate money. She had been purchased to serve as a wet nurse and a caretaker for the most hunted children in the territory. "Why me?" she whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes. "Why did you choose me?" "Because I watched you, standing in that mercantile," Gideon replied softly. "I watched your own father sell you like cattle. I saw the look in Boone's eyes when he touched you, and I saw the quiet, unbroken iron in your spine. You had nothing left to lose, Clementine, just like me, just like these kids. I needed someone who wouldn't run away when the wolves came circling." The revelation shifted something profound within Clementine's soul. She was not a useless, barren woman discarded by her family. She was an accomplice to justice, a protector of the innocent. She looked toward the loft where the children were beginning to stir. They were orphans, hunted and terrified, entirely reliant on a man who knew how to shoot but didn't know how to heal. "You sleep in the cabin from now on," Clementine said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "You will need to be close to the door if Boone's men ride up that trail." "I will take the back room with the baby and Mary." Gideon blinked, clearly taken aback by her sudden command. "Clementine, you understand the danger." "I understand that I am a mother now," she interrupted fiercely, lifting her chin. "I might not have birthed them, Gideon, but they are mine to protect. Now, show me how to load that Winchester. If the syndicate comes to Devil's Roost, they will find out exactly what a Barren woman is capable of." Over the next 3 months, the cabin on Devil's Roost transformed. It was no longer a bleak hideout. Under Clementine's relentless care, it became a home. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, sewed warm winter coats from Gideon's old wool blankets, and filled the air with the smell of baked bread and roasted venison. She rocked baby Ezra through his colic, taught little Mary how to plait her blonde hair, and patiently sat with 8-year-old Samuel as he learned to read from an old, battered Bible. Hannah, the withdrawn 12-year-old, slowly blossomed under Clementine's gentle guidance, finally speaking her first words since her parents' murder. But it was Levi, the angry 14-year-old, who proved the most difficult. He carried the heavy burden of his father's death, constantly patrolling the tree line with a hunting knife. Clementine didn't force him to talk. Instead, she stood shoulder to shoulder with him at the chopping block, matching him swing for swing with the axe, proving her worth through sweat and blistered hands. Slowly, the boy's icy exterior thawed, and he began to look at her not as a stranger, but as a lifeline. The dynamic between Clementine and Gideon also shifted. The gruff, distant mountain man watched in silent awe as this small, discarded woman breathed life back into the shattered children. They spent their evenings by the fire, Gideon meticulously cleaning his revolvers, while Clementine mended clothes. They spoke in hushed tones about the future, about Denver, and about the ledgers hidden beneath the floorboards. In the quiet darkness of the mountain, a deep, unbreakable respect forged itself into something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to love. But winter was closing in, and the isolation was playing a dangerous game with their supplies. By late November, baby Ezra developed a severe chest infection. The willow bark tea Clementine brewed wasn't enough to break the fever. They needed proper medicine from the apothecary in Oakhaven. "I'll go," Levi volunteered one evening, his jaw set stubbornly. "I can take the black gelding. I know the back trails. Nobody in town knows my face, Gideon. They only know you." Gideon refused at first, but as Ezra's breathing grew dangerously shallow, he had no choice. He gave Levi a small gold nugget and strict instructions to buy the medicine, keep his head down, and ride back in the dead of night. Levi made it to Oakhaven, bought the camphor and quinine, and almost made it out. But as he mounted the horse in the alley behind the apothecary, he was spotted by one of Boone's enforcers. The man recognized the black gelding, the same massive horse ridden by the towering stranger who had humiliated Jedediah Boone in the Mercantile months ago. Levi rode hard, losing his pursuer in the foothills. But the damage was done. He had left a trail. The syndicate finally knew where the mountain man was hiding. The first blizzard hit Devil's Roost 3 days later, burying the plateau in blinding white snow. The wind howled against the log walls. Ezra was finally recovering, sleeping peacefully, when the barn hounds started barking frantically. Gideon bolted upright, grabbing his Winchester rifle. He peered through the frosted glass. "They are here," Gideon snarled. "Boone and 10 riders." They surrounded the clearing. Panic pierced Clementine's chest, but she shoved it down. "Levi, take your siblings into the root cellar. Lock the iron latch and do not come out." "I am staying," Levi argued, pulling a Colt revolver. "Protect your siblings," Clementine commanded fiercely. Levi hesitated, then herded the children toward the pantry trapdoor. Before Clementine could grab the shotgun, the front window shattered inward. A bullet slammed into the hearth, showering the room in rock dust. "Get down!" Gideon roared, tackling her as gunfire tore through the heavy wooden door. Gideon rested his barrel on the sill, firing 3 rapid shots into the snow. A man screamed, followed by a heavy thud. "Cross!" Boone's voice echoed over the wind. I know who you are, Pinkerton. Hand over the ledgers and the Miller brats, and I will let you walk away alive. You are a liar, Boone, Gideon shouted, firing again. You will have to burn this cabin down to get to them. Light the torches. Boone laughed. Clementine grabbed the double shotgun, crawling to the rear window. Through the snow, she saw the faint glow of a pitch torch. A man was creeping toward the cabin, intent on setting the logs ablaze. She remembered Gideon's instructions. Breathe out, squeeze, do not pull. Clementine smashed the glass with the shotgun butt. The freezing wind whipped her face. The man looked up, raising his revolver, but Clementine was faster. She pulled the trigger. The deafening blast kicked her shoulder hard, knocking her backward. The man was thrown violently into the snowbank, his torch hissing out in a snowdrift. I got him, she yelled. The gunfight raged for hours, a chaotic blur of smoke and freezing wind. Gideon fought like a demon, moving from window to window, his rifle barking fire. But they were pinned down, and ammunition was running low. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the plateau. The ground shook violently. Clementine covered her head as dust rained down. Outside, the gunfire abruptly ceased. Gideon cautiously peered over the windowsill, his eyes widening. Riding through the snowdrifts were 20 men bearing gleaming silver badges, led by the territorial marshal. They had followed Boone's trail. The explosion was dynamite, used to blast a fallen pine tree, allowing the federal posse to flank the syndicate. Boone's men, outgunned, threw down their weapons. Boone tried to flee, but his horse slipped on icy rocks. He was thrown to the ground, surrounded instantly by Pinkertons. It was over. Gideon dropped his Winchester. His hands trembled, his face covered in soot. He rushed over, dropping to his knees, and pulled Clementine into his chest. She clung to him, sobbing into his canvas duster, releasing months of terror. You did it, Gideon whispered. You saved all of us. The root cellar creaked open. Levi peeked out, taking in the ruined cabin. The other children climbed out, running past the debris to throw their arms around Clementine and Gideon, creating a tangled, tearful pile of survival. 3 days later, the storm broke, leaving the mountain bathed in sunlight. Boone was in federal custody, and the Miller children were permanently safe. Gideon stood on the repaired porch, watching Clementine hang washed linens. The children were throwing snowballs and laughing, a sound the mountain had never heard before. He walked down and caught her hand. Clementine turned, looking up into his pale blue eyes, now filled with tender warmth. The agency wants me back in Denver, Gideon said softly. They offered a desk job. Safe, steady. Clementine's heart skipped. Are you taking it? Only if you and the kids come, Gideon replied with deep emotion. I bought a contract, but I want a wife. I want a partner. I love you. Then let us go home, Gideon. She warmly smiled. Did a gripping tale of survival, betrayal, and unexpected love on the untamed frontier capture your heart? Clementine's journey from a discarded daughter to a fierce, protective mother proves that family is forged in fire, not just in blood. If you love this Wild West story, please hit that like button, share it with your fellow history and romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical dramas. Leave a quick comment right below with your favorite moment.